In the last few lessons, we've been talking about the concept of the problem of evil, and we've been looking at different responses to the problem of evil, specifically focusing on the concept of theodicy, the idea that we can justify the existence of a God that is either all-loving or all-knowing or all-powerful or all of the above, and try and reconcile that with the existence of evil and suffering in the world. We've looked at Christian responses and Christian theodicy. We've looked at some developments in Christian theodicy, specifically looking at Augustinian theodicy, and now we're going to look at Jewish theodicy. And we're going to continue looking at all of these different kinds of theological responses to the problem of evil, because I think it's very important that ultimately the problem of evil is a problem that only exists within a religious tradition, because if you are somebody who is atheist, you would not need to explain or try and justify the existence of evil because you don't believe in an all-loving God. Which is why theodicy and the problem of evil is a question that is, or at least a challenge to the traditional conceptions of religion. So specifically, we're going to be looking at Jewish responses to the problem of evil and suffering, and we're going to be focusing on the work of Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides, who was a very influential philosopher and Jewish writer in the 12th century, and who came up with a number of different responses to the problem of evil. And then we're also going to look at what can be described as ultimately the biggest challenge to Jewish faith in an omnibenevolent God, and that being the responses that happened to the Holocaust, and talking about the Holocaust and what that means for faith for Jewish people as it relates to the problem of evil, because the problem of evil was never more pronounced than it was following the end of the Second World War and the discovery of the horrors that had happened in Europe. So specifically, Moses Maimonides, as I've already mentioned, was a 12th century philosopher, Jewish philosopher, whose works have been ultimately a cornerstone in the tradition of Jewish philosophy, and who has influenced a lot when it comes to the problem of evil and questions relating to evil and suffering. And this is specifically in his work Guide for the Perplexed. Maimonides outlined his conception of what he describes evil and suffering to be. And he does this by looking at the different types of suffering that could exist and the types of evil that exists. And he outlined the existence of three different kinds of suffering. The first of these being the existence of evil and suffering that happens to people as a result of their nature as physical beings. Now, this is something that is relatively easy to understand and relatively uncontroversial, because things such as old age, illness, and death, these relate to the existence of human beings as physical beings. The fact that we are physical means that we have to, in some way, endure the kinds of things that relate to illness and old age, and ultimately we will all die eventually. And these are things that happen as a result of our physical beings, and the fact that we are not eternal beings like God. Other things from this category include suffering that comes from natural physical processes, such as natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, etc. And the reason why this is included is because not only are we physical beings, but we also live in the physical reality. We live in the physical world. And so therefore, the physical world comes with it a number of different challenges that are presented by nature, effectively, things such as natural disasters. And so therefore, we can delineate this kind of evil from other kinds of evil that we've talked about in the past. And this is also something that is done in a lot of religious traditions anyway, because we have the distinction in generally within the philosophy of religion, there is a distinction between what we would describe as a natural evil, such as natural disasters or disease, for example, and physical evil, and or personal evil, or moral evil. These are the kinds of evils that exist as a result of the actions of people, and the actions that challenge our understanding of the world in which an all-loving God exists, and also challenges the morality of individuals. But it is argued by Maimonides that these evils, the evils that we've been talking about here, physical processes and natural disasters, are evils that do not challenge the goodness in God in any kind of way, because they are simply something that are baked into the physical existence. And if one of the things that comes with the nature of human beings as physical beings is the fact that we are physical beings, and so therefore have to deal with these physical challenges such as death and old age and natural disasters. The second kind of evil that Maimonides outlines is that the evils that exist as a result of suffering that is inflicted by people. And so this is where we start to move into the territory of things such as moral evils. So evils that are committed by individuals, murderers, for example, or people even as far as petty theft. These could also count as examples of evils that are suffered by people, inflicted by people. And Maimonides argues that this is also a kind of evil that is not the fault of God, but the fault of humanity and the fault of people. And so therefore, this again removes the question of the inconsistent triad from Maimonides' Theodicy and his philosophy, considering that he can justify the existence of evil and the existence of an all-loving God by arguing that humans have free will, in a sense, and that the evil that is and suffering that is inflicted by people is the fault of humanity and the fault of humans. And then finally we have evil that exists because it is inflicted by people on themselves. Again, this relates to the question of free will and also is not a question of God's inability to prevent this kind of evil. And it relates to punishments for acts committed by people. If you commit a punishment, if you commit a crime, for example, you are committing what Maimonides might describe as the second kind of evil. And in response to that, the punishment for that crime would be the third kind of evil, the punishment for acts committed by people. And it's interesting that if we looked at this from the lens of the ethics of punishment or the philosophy of punishment, Maimonides isn't describing punishment as something that is a good thing. He's describing it as an evil. But he's saying that this is an evil that is necessary for the existence of physical people, because humans are naturally going to commit evils, as described in the second point, but they are going to be punished, and this is a response to this second evil that exists. And so therefore we don't describe it as a good thing that punishment exists, but it is only simply a response to the acts committed by people. And again, taking it back to the philosophy of religion is not something that can be blamed. The blame cannot be placed on God. Now, later developments when it comes to Maimonides' philosophy and later Jewish thinkers have refined these basic principles that have been established by Maimonides. And they've argued that evil and suffering can be seen almost as an atonement for the sins of the individual. And it could also be suggested that not only is it the individual sins that are required for atonement, but also the sins of the collective. And so this is where we get the challenges to Jewish belief. And this is where we can talk about things such as the Holocaust. Now, there are other evils that were committed against Jewish faith throughout the entire 2,000 or so years of Jewish history. You can talk about the expelling and the exile from Babylon. You can talk about the Edward I, expelling Jews from England. You can talk about anti-Semitism that has existed in Europe for millennia, and also within the Middle East, and the challenges that are presented by the reconciliation of Jewish and Muslim beliefs. You can talk about the beliefs, you can talk about the anti-Jewish, the anti-Semitic pogroms that took place within the Russian Empire in the early 1900s. And you could also talk about anti-Semitism that exists in relation to, for example, the state of Israel today. We could talk about all of these different things, but we should really be focusing on what would be argued to be the ultimate infringement on the rights of these individuals, and also the ultimate evil, that being the Holocaust. And it's safe to assume that the Holocaust was either one of, if not the worst thing to ever happen in humanity. I don't think you were going to have many people debating that question. And with the Holocaust, with the true evil that did exist in this time, came a number of challenging questions to Jewish belief around the nature of evil and suffering. Because ultimately the question is effectively just a reiteration of the inconsistent triad. Would an all-loving, all-powerful God have sat back and allowed something like this to happen? Now, you might be able to explain away different kinds of evil using different kinds of theodicies, like Maimonides tried to do, talking about the punishment of humanity and the atonement for sins. Or you could even go to other kinds of examples. You could talk about things such as Augustine's theodicy, the concept of evil being there to illuminate the existence of the good, just like light and the shadow. But can we really apply these principles to things so horrific such as the Holocaust? And more broadly, could we apply these to other things as well that were horrific in human history? Things such as other kinds of genocides, other kinds of things such as the slave trade or war or famine or poverty. These things all really challenge the beliefs in an all-loving and all-powerful God, and really stretch theodicies to their limits because they are so horrific. And there are a number of responses to these challenges. So following the Holocaust, there was a great number of different responses on the part of Jewish people, and of course this was a time of great suffering and a time of a lot of reflection on the beliefs of individuals. I can imagine that it would be very difficult for any Jewish person who was living at that time to not feel like their faith was challenged by this horrendous act. Some lost faith in God entirely and succumbed to the inconsistent triad effectively, and said that ultimately, God cannot exist if God is all loving and all powerful and still allows this kind of evil to happen. Others had different views. They viewed the Holocaust in different ways. They, for example, believed in some cases that it was a punishment for sin, making claims that similar punishments have been inflicted in the past. So, again, make a list of all the different examples of anti-Semitism that has existed in history, stretching all the way back to the 2,000 years of Jewish history. You could make the claim that these were similar punishments, and the Holocaust was just another variation of this. However, this is often difficult to reconcile with most people, because the Holocaust was not only arguably worse than all of those previous examples, but also something that was indiscriminate among Jewish people, and was something that felt like, and if you were anybody who has studied the Holocaust in your history classes, for example, this is something that was ultimately almost a different kind of evil that existed. It's an evil that people didn't realize and didn't know could even possibly exist in the past. Others believed the Holocaust represented a test of faith. And this is just like where Job was tested. The Holocaust was seen as a test to see if people would remain faithful. But this again presents another challenge, because if God is all-knowing and all-loving and all-powerful, all of these attributes that we give to God, then surely he would already know that people are going to remain faithful if he's all-knowing in the first place. And so therefore, did God really needed to have genocide to test this faith? Now, ultimately, as we continue to study the different kinds of responses to the problem of evil, and we talk about different religious traditions to the problem of evil, we will run into the problem that exists at the bedrock of the inconsistent triad. And this is the concept of ultimately trying to reconcile all of these principles of God, all of these attributes of God, things like omnibenevolence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and trying to reconcile these together. And when we move on to looking at the attributes of God in more detail in this course, we will start to talk about different paradoxes that exist in relation to themselves. But ultimately, the problem of evil does fit into that as a problem as it relates to the attributes of God. And so in the next lesson, what we're going to do is carry on talking about different religious responses to the problem of evil, talking about Islamic responses to the problem of evil. A much shorter lesson, because ultimately, because of these all being Abrahamic religions, all sharing very, very similar traditions, if you were to simply read Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, you would see that they all share a lot of similar traditions. Therefore, they all share very similar responses to the problem of evil.